In Olivia Rodrigo's song Teenage Dream, she asks us as a 19-year-old, they all say that it gets better, but what if I don't? What then? It's a question that haunts all teenage girls and even us women as we get older. How will we ever heal or cope in a world that is obsessed with teenage girls when we're not teenage girls anymore? A world that looks down on grown women, and especially survivors of abuse. And it's a question that I thought a lot about when reading Giuffre's memoir, and a longer discussion that I want to have with you today. Content warning ahead for mentions and discussions of suicide, child sexual assault, and rape. And feel free to click away from the video at any time. On October 21st, 2025, Nobody's Girl, a memoir of surviving abuse and fighting for justice, Virginia Roberts Giuffre's posthumous memoir was released, and I started reading it that same day. The memoir was really rough to get through, especially knowing that she died by suicide earlier this year and is no longer with us, but I thought it was important that I read it in order to bear witness to her life, something that all victims of abuse deserve. And I feel like it's important that we discuss her book today because one of her goals with this memoir was to not only document and cement her life in print, but to help survivors of sexual abuse and to start conversations about abuse and the injustices she and many others have faced. Conversations about girlhood, youth, and fetishization that we as a patriarchal society would rather shy away from. She wrote in her email to Amy Wallace, her ghostwriter, that, in the event of my passing, I would like to ensure that Nobody's Girl is still released. I believe it has the potential to impact many lives and foster necessary discussions about these grave injustices. I kindly ask for your assistance in making this wish a reality. Thank you for your support, patience, and most importantly, love. And so I encourage you, if you're able to read her memoir and sit with the reality that was her life. I believe Virginia and you should too. So in the rest of this video, I want to have some of these hard discussions that come up when reading Nobody's Girl, particularly about how the patriarchal culture of sexualizing young girls has normalized abuse against them, making it harder for them to be believed. So without further ado, let's go. What stood out to me the most when reading Nobody's Girl are the photos of Virginia as a teenager, specifically the one with her in St. Tropez at Naomi Campbell's birthday party, when she was a sex trafficking victim of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. She was only 17 years old at the time. And when I look at this picture, I can't help but see how it would fit perfectly into this Hollywood narrative we all know too well, or at least that I know too well, and made a video about over 5 years ago, of the young, broken, sexualized teen girl on the run. A story told many times before, from Brooke Shields in Pretty Baby, to Natalie Portman in Leon the Professional, to Lolita starring Dominique Swain, to Hicks starring Chloe Grace Moretz, to even more recent examples such as the Lolita aesthetic donned by Lana Del Rey in the 2010s, or the mix of almost famous times young and on the run nostalgia in the Man-Child music video starring Sabrina Carpenter. The aestheticization and normalization of teen girls and young women adultified by trauma has been on repeat for decades, even though, at times, it's satirized. If it's successful, you be the judge. And in any of these dramatizations, Virginia would have been that young, blonde, Kate Hudson-esque teenager, the star of any gritty adult movie about a girl who was old for her age, but it wasn't a movie, it was her real life, and it was anything but romantic. And I think it's quite telling how these movies are what pop into my head when I see these pictures, because it speaks to my own socialization in this culture that fetishizes youth and broken girlhood, as well as how prolific this type of white, usually blonde teenager story is, and that's really sad to me because it stops us from viewing Virginia and other victims as real people, but rather as someone who fits into this Hollywood narrative of a teen or even a preteen whose life is hard, but they'll have a somewhat happy ending like Jodie Foster as Iris in Taxi Driver, or they'll die young and poor like Dominique Swain as Dolores in Lolita. But it doesn't matter because it's not real, it's just a story. But Virginia's life wasn't a movie. It could not be contained by satisfying narrative story beats. And even her memoir, the narrativization of her life, doesn't stop with this book. The camera didn't stop rolling at her marriage at 19 to Robbie, who allegedly abused her for years, nor with the birth of her children, or reconnecting with her mom. Her fight didn't stop, and her trauma didn't make her stronger, but rather it made her rightfully angry and depressed. One thing she kept repeating in the book was how her lifetime of assaults left her not being able to enjoy life and prohibited her from being able to sustain a sense of normalcy. I'd made my first lawsuit, Jane Doe 102 versus Epstein, the one that said I'd permanently suffered not only a loss of income, but a loss of the capacity to enjoy life.
It takes a long time to start the healing process. I mean, I will never heal. There are pieces from me that can never be put back together. It takes so long to get to a point where you're able just to speak about it. I mean, it took me having a daughter and looking at this beautiful, young, innocent baby to say, I want to speak out about it now. You know, if we can make that point across, that doesn't matter how rich you are, it doesn't matter how powerful you are, there are girls out there that will speak up, and I don't care if it's 10 years later or 15 years later, whenever you're ready to do it, you do it, you know, and you protect the ones that are younger than us. You protect the ones that we didn't protect before.
Not to mention she battled chronic pain in her neck and fibromyalgia as the pain from years of abuse caught up with her as she aged. In my darkest hours, especially when the pain in my neck immobilized me, reading headlines like those about the Prince Andrew allegations cut me to the quick. The fact that I suspected this was my critic's intent, call her a whore, that'll shut her up, didn't make it any easier to read. But we rarely see the older, struggling adult victim and survivor portrayed on screen because the sad reality is that what draws us as audience members of all ages and genders to these types of young and broken stories, both fictional and real, is the female victim's youth. But what happens when they get older? What happens when they grow up and speak out? What happens when they survive to tell the tale? Where are we then? Can we reckon with their pain as adults? Or are we only interested in them when they're young, beautiful, and suffering? It's a bias I think we should all check in on, including me. Under white patriarchy, girls and women are brought up to fetishize youth and objectify themselves, and it angers me that men get to control the way we view ourselves and others, and how that not only makes it harder to take adult abuse survivors seriously because they're old women now, but how it puts us in direct competition with older women. Virginia writes about how Ghislaine, as she turned 40, started to hurt Virginia more and more, and she assumed it had to do with her insecurity about her age. After she turned 40 on Christmas Day 2001, the insecurities that lurked under the surface of her outgoing persona emerged. A blazing beauty when she was young, Maxwell was still attractive, but her short haircut, while provocatively stylish for a woman of 20 or so, looked a bit haggard on someone twice that age. Increasingly, it was as if Maxwell was trying too hard. While she still prided herself on being the matron of Epstein's house, she seemed to chafe more and more at being seen as matronly. I, an 18-year-old, was too mature for him. She had to know that he saw her as downright ancient. She felt as though Epstein must have viewed Ghislaine in this way, and she reflects how weird that must have been for Maxwell, considering Epstein was clearly a pedophile. But I guess Maxwell was too, to be honest, because she too participated in the abuse and trafficking of teen and preteen girls, which is all sorts of fucked up. The older women in Virginia's life that she saw around her and around Epstein were enablers and helped traffic teenagers for him, not only Maxwell, but also, allegedly, Sarah Kellen. According to Epstein, as long as the girl was menstruating, it was his right to rape her. No matter how young a girl looked or how sexually inexperienced she was, if she had her period, he felt he could defend his abuse of her as part of the natural order of things. I was never sure who he imagined making this argument to. The girls themselves, his business associates, law enforcement officers, himself, but it was clear that he took a certain glee in what he saw as a loophole in society's moral code. There's also a special focus on white blonde girlhood in both fiction and reality, and it's the men, and at times their adult female accomplices, who unfortunately control how real girls view themselves, in again, both fiction and real life. Virginia talked about how Ron Eppinger, the first man who she claims trafficked her at 15, wanted an all-American look he wanted me to emulate. He insisted that I have my blonde hair dyed a lighter platinum like a teen Barbie doll's. Epstein believed in racial purity, and he wanted Virginia as an 18 to 19-year-old to be a surrogate for his and Maxwell's child. I'd already been told his criteria. Recruits were preferably white, with some wholesome girl-next-door looks that made them appear between 12 and 17 years old. He also fantasized about improving the human race by fathering children who carried his superior genes, something he talked about his plans to use Zorro Ranch as a literal breeding ground to propagate babies. Who would birth these imagined offspring? Then he came out with it. Jenna, I want you to have our baby. Though I'd heard him talk hypothetically about seeding the human race with his DNA, his proposal shocked me. In Hollywood, the young and broken narrative hyperfocuses on white blonde teenagers because they're the ideal victim. Their corruption can be fetishized. Whereas for non-white girls, specifically for black girls, they're already seen as adult by default due to their race. There's racist stereotypes that black people feel less pain or that they're less human, but white girls on the other hand are idolized for their angelic purity. That doesn't mean that non-white girls can't be fetishized, and in fact in other non-white cultures like in South Korea, the youngest members of girl and boy groups are extremely fetishized because of their age. But in the US, the proliferation of the young, broken, white teen girl and the clear historical typecasting of white teen actresses in these roles cannot be denied. And we as girls growing up in this culture, even us non-white girls, are flooded with images of young, white, blonde, broken girls to idolize and emulate ourselves after. And I did as a teen. I was really curious about Lolita in high school, especially since it kept popping up in the TV series Pretty Little Liars and in the popular music of the day. I was intrigued by Hick with Chloe Grace Moretz, who I as a teen thought was kind of badass. She was even typecast as the cool girl in Diary of a Wimpy Kid, who sat under the bleachers and ditched class. Worse still, Moretz was sexualized in Louis C.K.'s film I Love You, Daddy. And these child actresses playing young and broken girls have also been, like Virginia was, sexualized and hurt because of this sort of typecasting and this adult male fantasy that men insist to live out in any way they can. Chloe Grace Moretz has gone on record saying how disgusted her and her brother were when a producer on one of her projects wanted her in a push-up bra and chicken cutlets or silicone inserts to make her breasts look bigger when she was 16. And even before, when she was 15 in Hick, she was being sexualized.
Around 15, 16 is when everything changed for me. That's when I started to realize, oh, a group of people looked at a 16-year-old girl in the screen tests, and they said her breasts didn't look big enough. And they ordered wardrobe to bring me 2 chicken cutlets and a push-up bra at 16. And I was like, no.
Natalie Portman has said publicly that her first fan letter she read was a rape fantasy when she was 13.
Was released and my work and my art would have a human response. I excitedly opened my first fan mail to read a rape fantasy that a man had written me. A countdown was started on my local radio show to my 18th birthday, euphemistically the date that I would be legal to sleep with. Movie reviewers talked about my budding breasts in reviews. I understood very quickly, even as a 13-year-old, that if I were to express myself sexually, I would feel unsafe.
No girl is safe under the patriarchy, but the normalization of fetishization of child actresses in Hollywood makes us even more numb to non-famous victims of abuse, like Virginia once was. Who would believe her, she thought to herself as a young adult. She lived in a world where victims were silenced or ignored.
When you grow up in a world where adult men rape children and nobody does anything about it, then you start to believe that's how the world actually is. So the thought of escaping from Epstein's Manhattan townhouse, and she didn't think the world outside was any different.
The headlines that came out when Virginia first spoke up about Prince Andrew and Epstein called her a gold digger, a willing participant, a liar, and though recently the public has been more willing to believe victims since then, there are still people out there willing to protect the monarchy instead of child trafficking victims. I just think it's important to highlight how men get to control the narrative around teen girls' sexuality, both in fiction and in real life, and how that by design makes it even harder for victims to be believed and heard because it's so normal, and how that protects predators. It's so normal that girls even explore the taboo of the age gap fantasy and relationship in their own fiction made for and by other women. I made another video about that here in order to prepare them for what the patriarchy expects of them. Here I'm reminded of Olivia Rodrigo's song Teenage Dream, where she asks, "When am I gonna stop being wise beyond my years and just start being wise? When am I gonna stop being a pretty young thing to guys? When am I gonna stop being great for my age and just start being good? When will it stop being cool to be quietly misunderstood?" Because she's so aware at just 19 of the little time girls and young women have to be cared about in this world before society throws them away. We're simultaneously brought up in a world where we know as young girls we're only valuable in our youth, but also know that youth makes us vulnerable to predators, and thus we're also eager to grow up. We both want to hold on to what makes us special, but know that it's fleeting, and that fighting against time is futile. And I think another reason why this broken teen girl narrative tends to find a young female audience like Lolita gives that did on Tumblr back in the day, and why I find Man-Child by Sabrina Carpenter to be such a throwback and homage to that era, though she denies ever seeing or hearing about the film itself, is because it's framed as romantic in the sense of this is what freedom for young girls look like, being on the road, far from home, no parents, and with an older guy sometimes. How scandalous. And Hick gets framed the same way. She's a gun-wielding teen. The same with Leon the Professional. The frames from these movies are able to be reimagined as escapism. And what teen doesn't fantasize about having freedom, being away from parents? In a way, I can see how this art can help teens viewing it feel like they're in control or being heard. And even in the 1997 movie Lolita, it doesn't end with a happily ever after. But I still find it really insidious how the aesthetic of the films, specifically the rural white trash vibe, are able to be repackaged and sold as something freeing, because in reality it's in the service of men. It normalizes relationships with older men who abuse or at the very least use you, and instead sells it as coming of age. But we are waking up more and more as Virginia's story and others have come out and have been believed in a post-Me Too world. Virginia cites the song Victoria's Secret by Jax, whose owner is Les Wexner, a close friend of Epstein, and she cites the song in this memoir to bring hypocrisy to light. The lyrics go, "I know Victoria's Secret, and girl, you wouldn't believe she's an old man who lives in Ohio, making money off girls like me, cashing in on body issues, selling skin and bones with big boobs. I know Victoria's Secret. She was made up by a dude." In the end, Hollywood producers, directors, writers, and casting agents normalize, romanticize, and aestheticize the fetishization of young girls, and then repackage it for us as teens and young women to consume and reproduce, and then men like Epstein and even women like Ghislaine Maxwell, along with their billionaire male associates, academics, and royalty, got to live out their most depraved fantasies with real children. Sitting with that truth is so unbearable, but we have to reckon with it because if we don't, it'll just keep happening and continue to be normalized in real life and in art. And seemingly, at least right now, there will be no accountability, no jail time for Trump, no jail time for Bill Gates, and the former prime minister she mentions, or the MIT professors. And honestly, a few of the people she named who raped her are dead because that's how old they were when she was trafficked to them. When I see photos of Virginia as a 40-year-old woman, as a survivor, I can't help but feel amazed that she endured for so long, and that those little girls who were treated so horribly throughout their life grew up and have found the courage to speak out. One chapter of her book is even called Unbroken. But the reality is that not all of them did get to grow up or grow old due to the effects of their trauma, and that's the saddest thing to me. And I just think it's really important that we keep believing victims and read their stories because I think as they age, it'll be harder for them to get the same press than if they were younger due to age bias in the media and our own age bias we have as consumers.
First time that I ever speak publicly about what happened to me. The only reason that I am here is because it feels like the people who matter in this country finally care about what we have to say. As an immigrant from Brazil, I feel empowered knowing that the little girl struggling to get by at 14 and 15 years old finally has a voice.
We as a society have a huge bias against older women because they're no longer desirable to the men who abuse them and fantasized about them, and because we as the public, as a society, have been brought up in a world where women are only valuable when they're young, thin, suffering, and beautiful, essentially up until like 25, and then you become an old shriveled prune and no one wants to pretend to listen to you anymore. Though I will say Gisèle Pelicot was believed, and she also has tons of evidence on her side, but really, no woman is safe under the patriarchy, no matter what they look like or how old they are. But for me, that's what made Giuffre's memoir so important, because it seems like we only care to see the young broken girl, to fetishize her, at least in Hollywood media, but not the adult woman, the survivor who lived to tell her story. In some parts of Virginia's book, she recalls things that Epstein had said to her that solidifies for me how broken his mind was under the patriarchy and how dehumanizing he was towards girls and women. For example, his Palm Beach house was pink because he apparently said to her, "Pink is for pussy." He even had pink sheets, and I presumed that was also because of pussy. He also wanted to be kept in a cryogenic chamber when he died to be resurrected later. Epstein had repeatedly told me exactly what would happen when he died. His body would be placed in some sort of cryogenic chamber to be preserved until technology advanced far enough to bring him back to life. That's what he'd always bragged to me, with that satisfied smirk on his face. I know it sounds far-fetched, but I wouldn't bet against the notion that he somehow got his way on this. And he used to joke about how girls are just vessels for vaginas. Today I know that Epstein liked to tell his friends that women were merely a life support system for a vagina. He also used to brag about taking girls' virginities to Giuffre, and liked to see his victims suffer. And he wasn't alone in that. Maxwell and their partners were also happy to see children suffer at their hands. I'm not going to pathologize him here, or Maxwell, but I agree with Giuffre that he specifically was a narcissist, to say the least. Epstein was the ultimate narcissist, she writes. He believed he was superior to others, and I never saw in him a scintilla of self-doubt. There's been some talk about the male loneliness epidemic and how the patriarchy hurts men, and I think Epstein and his clan are perfect examples of that. They were so rotten because they believed and internalized all that BS. That men are owed women and girls, that men are entitled to other people, even children, as property to be bought and sold. No wonder they don't care about bombing starving children, and they believe this type of world that they created for themselves was perfect, and that they were winning at life because they got away with it for so long, and got to live like quote-unquote kings in marble penthouses and giant horse ranches surrounded by naked teenagers. And the only pleasure I can take in this is that they didn't get away with it, because Virginia and her survivor sisters, as she calls them, were able to come forward and convict them to some degree at least. But in the end, Epstein is an example of how the patriarchy lets men get away with their most depraved desires once they have the money and power to do so. And I'm sure there's men who look up to the likes of these people, as seen in Trump's birthday card. But as much as they say they were winning at life, that they were riding high, they've dehumanized themselves so much that they have no empathy. And what kind of life is that? That you can't feel for other people, that you take pleasure in causing someone else's misery. What kind of man wants to be like that? Is that utopia to you? We need to live in a world where men are raised to respect and empathize with women and children, and where that's strength, not weakness. But that's a conscious choice men have to make under patriarchal capitalism. And I don't know how to incentivize men to act that way, especially since the main incentive they're brought up with is having money and owning women, but it's not up to women and girls to make sure men treat them well. And sadly, women like Maxwell and even Giuffre's own mother was an enabler of her own daughter's abuse. Giuffre has said that her mom probably knew that her father was molesting her and even blamed her for what her husband did to her, and as adults, the two were never really able to talk about Virginia's childhood. At one point, Virginia's mother yelled at her daughter while she was hiding under the dining room table because she didn't want to take a bath with her father, and her mom yelled at her saying, "Look at what you're making me do," as she poked her daughter with a broom to go in the bathroom with her husband. And sadly, this mimics the relationship Gisèle Pelicot and her daughter Caroline Dahian, in which Pelicot was drugged and raped by her husband and tens of other strangers, and she doesn't believe her own daughter was also raped by her ex-husband. "My mother isn't an icon," Caroline told the Telegraph. "Not to me." Dahian said she is upset that her mother doesn't believe her claims that she too was drugged and raped by her father, Dominique Pelicot, even as she supported her mother for years. "And that I can never forgive her for," she told the Telegraph. So they're estranged now. Virginia wonders why her mother didn't do anything to stop her father because she knew about it, but she still tried to reconnect with both her parents as an adult, which is something that I couldn't even believe because it couldn't be me. But that's what she wanted. And the truth of the matter is that men and women are crushed under patriarchy, resulting in horribly broken homes and broken children. Centering male fantasies and desires puts women against each other, even mothers and daughters. And parents never want to admit that they failed their children because it would mean that the abuse suffered by their offspring was their fault. And that's extremely painful to confront. Very few people want to do that. So instead, Giuffre's mother insisted they don't bring up the past. And for men, living under a male-dominated world twists them into facsimiles of human beings who claim to want to protect and nurture young girls and women, as Giuffre pretended to do with Virginia, but who in reality want to control and own them and use them for their own ends. Not all men and not all women, but the patriarchal system is all-encompassing, affecting home life, married life, family life, work life, etc. It's more than just individual relationships and choices. It's about larger institutions that continue to protect abusers, men and women, though Maxwell is still in jail for now, and how it again creates a society that normalizes abuse against women and girls as just coming of age. I think it's important to read, believe, and share Virginia's story not only because that's what she wanted, but because adult female survivors who are no longer sexually desirable to men are so often overlooked because of how we're socialized to only care about young, sexy women. Reading and bearing witness to Virginia's memoir and having these discussions is part of validating her story and saying yes, this happened to her and that she matters. Because there are still people out there who don't believe her, or equally as bad, only believe Virginia because it plays into some alt-right anti-Jewish conspiracy. I didn't bring up the Epstein conspiracy theories here because I don't want to proliferate them, and I don't think that they're the real story. Though Virginia does bring up some of them in her memoir, specifically about how he died. The real story to me, though, is Virginia's life. What happened to her, how it's sadly so emblematic of a patriarchal culture that grooms teen girls into thinking that age gaps are normal, that adultification through trauma and sexualization is just part of growing up, and how that hurts real girls from all walks of life. From celebrity actresses to human trafficking victims like Virginia, to high schoolers who might not have been abused but who will go on to normalize abuse that they see as bystanders. Like I said earlier, I think because we live in a world that idolizes youth, we don't know how to cope when we see adult female survivors of child sexual abuse, because for us, the media, and for their abusers, their youth is what makes them interesting as subjects, but when they age out and grow up, where does that leave them? At the end of Teenage Dream, Olivia Rodrigo sings, "I'll blow out the candles, happy birthday to me, got your whole life ahead of you, you're only 19, but I fear that they already got all the best parts of me, and I'm sorry that I couldn't always be your teenage dream." Then she asks, "They all say that it gets better, but what if I don't? But don't worry, you will."